The sun dipped low over the horizon, casting the shoreline in hues of amber and rose. The waves whispered secrets to the sand, their rhythm steady and hypnotic, as the family of three unpacked their luggage from the back of a rented SUV. Richard stretched his arms overhead, his muscles tight from the long drive, while Charlotte, his wife of 14 years, directed their teenage daughter on which bags to carry. "Just take the lighter ones, Olivia," Charlotte said, her voice calm but firm. She adjusted her sunglasses, their dark lenses hiding eyes that had been distant for weeks. Olivia, now rolling her eyes with the practiced ease of a 15-year-old, dragged the duffel bag toward the steps of the rental house. "It's not like I'm helpless, Mom," she muttered under her breath. Richard chuckled lightly. "Give her some credit, Char. She's growing up faster than we think." Charlotte glanced at him, her lips curving into a polite smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Faster, sure. But some things never change." The gentle rhythm of the waves set a fragile peace between them, yet Richard couldn't shake the feeling that their exchange had only skimmed the surface. As they turned and began walking along the shoreline, the soft crunch of wet sand underfoot was the only sound filling the silence between them. Charlotte's hand rested limply in his. He wanted to tighten his grip, to assure her of his presence, but he hesitated, afraid of crossing an invisible boundary. Instead, he let the moment breathe, waiting for her to speak again. "You always loved the water," she said, her voice carrying a distant quality. "I remember when we were dating. You'd take me to that little lake upstate. You said it was where you thought best." Richard smiled faintly, though the memory felt like a photograph faded with age. "I think I just wanted to impress you," he admitted. "I was terrified of doing or saying the wrong thing back then." Charlotte glanced sideways at him, her lips curving into the barest hint of a smile. "You were charming in your awkwardness," she said. "It made everything feel real." They walked a few more steps in silence before she stopped, pulling her hand from his to wrap her arms around herself. The wind had picked up, brushing strands of hair across her face. "That's what I miss," she said, almost to herself. "That feeling of things being real. Honest. Like we weren't just playing roles in some endless routine." Richard turned to face her fully, his hands slipping into his pockets. "I know what you mean," he said. "Somewhere along the way, it stopped being about us and started being about everything else." Charlotte's eyes searched his face, her expression unreadable. "Do you ever think about what it would have been like if we hadn't had Olivia so soon?" she asked. The question hit him like a punch to the gut, though her tone was free of accusation. He opened his mouth to answer, then closed it again, grappling with the weight of her words. "Sometimes," he admitted finally. "Not because I regret her, God, never that, but because I wonder if we would have had more time to figure ourselves out before everything else came rushing in." Charlotte nodded, her gaze dropping to the sand. "I love her more than anything," she said softly. "But sometimes I feel like I've been running on autopilot since the day she was born. Like I lost pieces of myself somewhere along the way, and I don't know how to get them back." "You're not alone in that," Richard said, stepping closer. "I feel it too. Like I've been so focused on being the provider, the fixer, that I forgot how to just be your husband." Her head snapped up at his words, a flicker of something, hope? Pain, crossing her face. "Do you mean that?" she asked. "Of course I do," he said. "Charlotte, I've been so blind. I see it now, how distant I've been, how much I've taken you for granted. And I hate myself for it. But if there's even a small part of you that still believes in us, I want to fight for that." She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she turned her gaze back to the ocean, her posture tense with thought. Richard's heart thudded in his chest as he waited, the seconds stretching into what felt like hours. Finally, she spoke. "I want to believe in us," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I don't know if I can trust that things will change." "That will change." "They can," he said, his voice firm but not forceful. "It won't be easy, and I can't promise I won't screw up along the way. But I swear to you, Charlotte, I'll do whatever it takes." Her shoulders slumped slightly, as if the weight of her thoughts was too heavy to carry any longer. She turned to him, and for the first time that night, he saw tears glistening in her eyes. "I'm so tired, Richard," she admitted. "Tired of feeling like we're just surviving each other." His chest ached at the rawness in her words. Without thinking, he reached for her hand again, this time holding it firmly. "Then let's stop surviving," he said. "Let's start living again. Together." The vulnerability in his voice seemed to crack through her defenses. She stepped closer, her free hand brushing against his chest as though testing his sincerity. "Do you really mean that?" she asked, her voice trembling. Because I can't do this alone anymore. You won't have to, he said, his own voice breaking. I'm here, Char. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. For a moment they simply stood there, the ocean whispering around them, the weight of their shared pain hanging in the air. Then, slowly, Charlotte leaned into him, her head resting against his shoulder. Richard wrapped his arms around her, holding her as tightly as he dared. The gesture wasn't a solution, nor was it a promise of a perfect future. But it was a beginning, a fragile, tentative step toward mending what had been broken. And for now it was enough. The words hung in the warm air, their edge sharper than intended. Richard's smile faltered for a moment before he busied himself with the heavier suitcases. He caught a faint scent of salt and sunscreen as a breeze rolled in from the ocean, stirring the light fabric of Charlotte's dress. She had always loved the sea, he remembered, though it had been years since they'd visited. The house was a vision of coastal charm, whitewashed walls, wide windows that opened to the waves, and weathered wooden floors that creaked underfoot. By the time they had settled into their respective rooms, the evening had settled fully over the beach. Richard found himself standing on the deck, a beer in hand, as he watched the waves roll in under the emerging starlight. "Long day," a voice asked softly from behind him. He turned to see Charlotte, a glass of wine in hand. The light from the house framed her silhouette, casting her features in soft shadow. For a moment, she looked like the woman he'd married, untouched by the years, unburdened by the weight of time. "Feels longer than it probably was," Richard replied. He motioned toward the waves. "Nice view, though." She stepped closer, leaning on the railing beside him. Her fingers grazed the wood, delicate and hesitant. "It's why I picked this place. Thought we could all use a change of scenery." He glanced at her, searching her face for the warmth that had been missing. "It's a good choice. Thanks for organizing everything." She nodded, her lips pressed tightly together. The silence between them stretched, broken only by the distant rush of waves and the occasional chirp of a cricket. He took a long sip of his beer, wondering if the tension he felt was real or imagined. "I'm going for a walk," she said suddenly, setting her glass down on the railing. "Just down the beach." He opened his mouth to offer to join her, but the look in her eyes stopped him. It wasn't a request, it was a statement. "Okay," he said, watching her step off the deck and disappear into the dusk. The house felt cavernous and too quiet after she left. Richard wandered through the living room, checking on Olivia, who was already buried in her phone, headphones in and oblivious to the world outside. He hesitated near the door, then grabbed his jacket and decided to follow the shoreline. Charlotte's footprints were easy to find, her delicate stride weaving a path near the waterline. He walked slowly, giving her space but not ready to let her drift entirely away. The night air was cool, carrying the scent of salt and something bittersweet. As he rounded a curve in the shoreline, he spotted her. She was standing ankle-deep in the water, her shoes left in a neat pile nearby. The hem of her dress swayed in the breeze, and her arms were wrapped around herself as though holding in something fragile. "Char," he called gently, his voice carrying over the waves. She didn't turn immediately, her posture stiffening as though caught off guard. When she finally looked back, her face was unreadable. "Couldn't resist following, huh? I wanted to make sure you were okay," he said, stopping a few paces away. "You seemed far away tonight." She turned her gaze back to the horizon, the stars reflected faintly in her eyes. "Maybe I needed to be." The words stung more than he expected. "Is it me?" he asked after a pause, his voice quieter. "Have I done something wrong?" Her laugh was soft, almost bitter. "Not everything is about you, Richard." "Then tell me what it's about," he said, stepping closer. "We can't keep doing this, dancing around whatever it is that's been sitting between us for months." She let out a long breath, her shoulders sagging slightly. "I don't even know where to start." "Start anywhere," he urged. "Just don't leave me in the dark." The vulnerability in his voice seemed to crack something in her, and she looked at him fully for the first time that night. "Do you remember the last time we took a trip like this? Just the two of us?" He searched his memory, struggling to pinpoint a moment in their history that matched what she was asking. The silence that followed was answer enough. "I thought so," she said softly, her voice laced with resignation. "Char, you don't have to apologize," she interrupted. "This isn't about blame. It's just, life got busy. We got busy. And somewhere along the way, I forgot what it felt like to just be." "Seen." Her words hit like a cold wave, unexpected and unavoidable. Richard stepped closer, his hands itching to reach for her, but unsure if they were welcome. "You're not invisible to me," he said, his voice steady despite the storm brewing in his chest. I know I've been distant, but it wasn't intentional. I thought we were okay. I thought you were okay. Her expression softened, but the sadness in her eyes remained. Maybe I didn't want you to see how much I wasn't. The tide rushed in, lapping at their feet and pulling the sand from under them. The world around them seemed to hold its breath as they stood there, caught in the fragile space between confession and reconciliation. As the waves continued their steady rhythm against the shore, Richard held Charlotte in his arms, their shared silence more profound than any words. The night air wrapped around them like a fragile cocoon, and for the first time in years, they both allowed themselves to simply be present in each other's space. Charlotte pulled back slightly, her hands still resting lightly on his chest. Her eyes met his, and Richard was struck by the layers of emotion in her gaze, pain, doubt, but also a flicker of something else. Hope, maybe. Do you think we can really do this? She asked, her voice soft but searching. Richard nodded, though the lump in his throat made it difficult to speak. I don't just think we can, I know we have to. For us, for Olivia. But mostly for you and me. Because if we don't try, we'll lose something we'll never get back. Her lips parted as if to respond, but instead, she simply studied his face, as though trying to read the sincerity in his words. Richard didn't look away, holding her gaze with a quiet intensity that felt like a promise. The sound of approaching footsteps broke the spell. They turned to see a couple walking along the shore, their laughter mingling with the night air. Richard felt Charlotte tense slightly, and he instinctively stepped closer, shielding her from the intrusion. They'll pass, he said softly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. She nodded, her expression unreadable. Once the couple disappeared into the distance, she let out a shaky breath and turned back to him. I've been holding so much in, she admitted, her voice barely audible over the waves. For so long, I've been afraid to say how I really feel. Afraid it would break us completely. And I've been afraid to listen, Richard said, his tone heavy with regret. But I'm here now, Char. Whatever you need to say, I'm ready to hear it. Her eyes filled with unshed tears, and for a moment, Richard thought she might turn away again. But instead, she surprised him by stepping closer, her hands curling into the fabric of his shirt. I need to know you'll fight for me, she said, her voice trembling. Not just tonight, not just when it's easy, but when it's messy and hard and feels impossible. I will, he said without hesitation. Every day for as long as it takes. The raw honesty in his words seemed to reach her. Slowly, she relaxed against him, her head resting on his chest once more. They stood there like that, the ocean lapping at their feet, the stars above them glittering like distant promises. It wasn't a perfect moment. The weight of their shared history still loomed large, and the road ahead was far from certain. But for now they had this fragile, fleeting connection that felt like the first step toward something better. And for the first time in a long time, Richard allowed himself to believe in the possibility of healing. Together, the faint glow of dawn began to seep into the horizon, casting soft hues of pink and orange over the ocean. Charlotte hadn't moved from Richard's arms, though the night had grown cooler, and the tide had receded slightly. Their closeness felt like an unspoken agreement, a silent decision to hold on to this moment for as long as it would last. I used to watch the sunrise from our porch, Charlotte murmured, breaking the quiet. Every morning, while you were getting ready for work. It was my time, my space to think. Richard ran his fingers gently through her hair, his touch tentative but reassuring. What did you think about? Us, she admitted, her voice tinged with vulnerability. What we used to be, what we'd lost, and whether we could ever find our way back. He swallowed hard, the weight of her words settling into his chest. And now, what do you see when you look at the horizon? Charlotte tilted her head, her gaze fixed on the emerging light. Possibility, she said softly. But I'm scared, Richard. I don't want to lose myself again trying to fix something that might already be too broken. You won't, he said firmly, his hands cupping her face so she would look at him. Whatever happens, you'll never lose yourself again. I promise you that. Her lips trembled, and for a moment, Richard thought she might pull away. Instead, she reached up, her fingers brushing against his. You say that now, but... I mean it, he interrupted, his voice steady. I didn't fight for you the way I should have before. I won't make that mistake again. The intensity in his gaze made her falter. She wanted to believe him, but the scars of the past weren't so easily erased. Words are easy, Richard. Then let me show you, he said, his voice low but resolute. Not just today, but every day. Let me prove that I can be the man you deserve. Charlotte's breath hitched, and she felt a tear slip down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away, didn't turn from him. Instead, she allowed herself to lean into his touch, to let the warmth of his hands and the strength of his promise anchor her. The sun crept higher, painting the world in gold. It was a new day, and though the future remained uncertain, Charlotte felt the faint stirrings of hope, a fragile ember she hadn't dared to nurture in years. Richard pressed a kiss to her forehead, lingering as if trying to imprint the moment into his memory. "We'll take it one step at a time," he whispered. "Together." And for the first time in what felt like forever, Charlotte allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could. The rest of the day passed in a hazy blend of tentative steps and unspoken gestures. Richard and Charlotte moved through the motions of their vacation: breakfast on the terrace, a quiet stroll along the beach, and the shared silence of a lazy afternoon spent reading in the sun. Yet beneath the surface, the air between them felt charged, as if every glance, every accidental touch, carried more weight than either dared to acknowledge. As the evening approached, Charlotte found herself drawn to the ocean again. She stood barefoot at the water's edge, the hem of her sundress brushing against her legs as the wind toyed with her hair. The sky above was a canvas of deepening blues and purples, the first stars beginning to wink into view. "Penny for your thoughts?" Richard's voice came from behind her, soft but steady. She turned to find him standing a few steps away, his hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. "I'm just thinking," she said, her voice barely audible above the sound of the waves. "About us. About everything." Richard stepped closer, his gaze unwavering as he studied her. "And?" Charlotte hesitated, her arms wrapping around herself as if to guard against the vulnerability threatening to spill over. "And I don't know where we go from here." He nodded slowly, his brow furrowing in thought. "I don't have all the answers, Charlotte, but I know I don't want to go back to what we were. I want more than that for both of us." She looked up at him, her eyes searching his face for the truth behind his words. "It's not just about wanting more, Richard. It's about rebuilding trust, about finding a way to connect again after everything that's happened." "I know," he said softly, stepping even closer. "And I'm willing to do whatever it takes. But I need you to meet me halfway." Her breath caught, the weight of his words settling heavily on her shoulders. "What if I can't? What if I'm too scared to try?" Richard reached out, his hand brushing against hers in a gesture that was both tender and grounding. "Then we'll take it slow, step by step, day by day. But you're not in this alone, Charlotte. I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." The sincerity in his voice, the unwavering determination in his gaze, made something inside her soften. She felt the familiar ache of longing, the desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, they could find their way back to each other. "Okay," she said finally, her voice trembling but resolute. "But we need to be honest with each other and with ourselves. No more pretending everything's fine when it's not." Richard nodded, his fingers curling around hers in a firm but gentle grip. "Agreed. No more pretending." They stood there in the fading light, the sound of the waves crashing against the shore filling the space between their words. And for the first time in a long while, Charlotte felt a flicker of something she thought she'd lost, a sense of possibility, of hope. As the stars began to scatter across the night sky, Richard pulled her into his arms, holding her as if she were the only thing keeping him grounded. And as she rested her head against his chest, Charlotte allowed herself to believe, if only for a moment, that maybe, just maybe, they could begin again. The resort was bathed in moonlight, the soft glow transforming the manicured gardens into something almost ethereal. Charlotte and Richard walked slowly back toward their villa, their steps unhurried, as if prolonging the moment would stave off the uncertainty that awaited them. "I don't remember the last time we walked like this," Charlotte said, breaking the comfortable silence. "Just together." Richard glanced at her, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "It feels good, like we're finding something again." She nodded, but the vulnerability in her eyes betrayed her lingering doubt. "It's just so easy to fall back into old habits, to lose sight of why we're even trying." Richard stopped walking, turning to face her. "That's why we have to keep talking, keep reminding each other of what's important." "And what is that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He stepped closer, his hands reaching out to gently cup hers. "You, us, whatever that looks like now. I don't want to keep looking back at what we lost. I want to figure out what we still have and where we can go." His words hung in the air, laden with emotion. Charlotte felt the sting of tears behind her eyes, but she blinked them back, unwilling to let the moment become too heavy. "I'm scared, Richard," she admitted. "Scared of getting hurt again. Scared of hurting you." "I know," he said softly. And I'm scared too. But I'd rather be scared together than not have you at all. She looked at him, truly looked at him, and for the first time in a long while, she saw the man she'd fallen in love with, the man who had once been her anchor in every storm. Slowly, she nodded, a faint smile breaking through the uncertainty. Okay, she said, her voice steadier now. Together. Richard exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding and pulled her into his arms. She let herself lean into him, her head resting against his chest, as the sound of his heartbeat mixed with the distant rhythm of the ocean. It was a fragile moment, but it was real. They stayed like that for a long while, wrapped in the quiet promise of trying again. When they finally pulled apart, the path to their villa stretched ahead of them, illuminated by the soft glow of lanterns. Come on, Richard said, his voice warm and inviting. Let's go home. Charlotte hesitated, her gaze lingering on the stars scattered across the night sky. Then she took his hand, their fingers intertwining, and together, they walked toward the uncertain but hopeful future waiting for them. The villa was quiet when they entered, the kind of silence that felt more comforting than oppressive. Richard moved to the kitchenette, reaching for the bottle of red wine they had picked up at the local vineyard earlier that day. Charlotte sat down on the plush sofa, her fingers absently tracing the delicate embroidery on a pillow. Want a glass? He asked, already pouring. She nodded, watching him. The simple act of him standing there, sleeves rolled up, pouring wine as if the day had been ordinary, tugged at something deep inside her. It felt familiar yet distant, like a melody she couldn't quite place. He handed her the glass and took a seat across from her, their knees almost touching. The wine caught the lamplight, glowing ruby red between them. To us, he offered, raising his glass hesitantly. Charlotte hesitated, then clinked her glass gently against his. To us, she echoed, though the words felt fragile, like they might shatter under the weight of the unspoken. They drank in silence for a moment, the wine warm and rich on her tongue. Richard set his glass down on the coffee table and leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. I've been thinking about what you said earlier, he began, his voice steady but cautious. About being scared. I think fear has been running the show for both of us for too long. Charlotte tilted her head, studying him. What do you mean? I mean, we've been tiptoeing around each other, around everything for so long. Afraid to say the wrong thing, afraid to upset the balance, afraid to even admit what we want. He paused, his eyes searching hers. But maybe that's what's been keeping us stuck. She set her glass down, her fingers suddenly restless. It's not that simple, Richard. It's not just fear. It's everything. The past, the mistakes, the hurt. You can't just ignore that. I'm not saying we ignore it, he said quickly. I'm saying we stop letting it define us. We've been holding on to it like it's some kind of map, but all it's doing is keeping us lost. His words hit her like a wave, threatening to pull her under. She looked away, her gaze falling to the floor. I don't know if I can do that, she admitted. I don't know if I know how. Richard leaned back, giving her space. I don't have all the answers, Charlotte. I wish I did. But what I do know is that I don't want to keep living in this limbo. I want to move forward with you. The sincerity in his voice, the raw honesty, made her chest tighten. She looked up at him, her own emotions mirrored in his eyes. I want that too, she said softly. But I don't know where to start. He reached out, his hand hovering just above hers before settling gently on top of it. We start here. With this. With us. The warmth of his touch, the steadiness of his words, grounded her in a way she hadn't felt in years. Slowly, she nodded, a faint smile breaking through the cracks of her uncertainty. Okay, she whispered. Here. They stayed like that for a long moment, the space between them filled with quiet understanding. Outside, the ocean murmured its eternal rhythm, a reminder that even the strongest waves eventually find their way to shore. The room felt lighter somehow, as if the air had shifted with their fragile truce. Richard leaned back, his hand reluctantly withdrawing from hers. He picked up his glass again, his movements unhurried, as though savoring the stillness between them. Charlotte exhaled softly and stood, the hem of her dress brushing her knees as she crossed to the window. She pushed the sheer curtain aside and looked out at the ocean, its dark expanse broken only by the moon's silvery path. We used to talk about living by the sea, she murmured. Do you remember? You always said it would be good for the soul. Richard smiled faintly, his gaze fixed on her silhouette. I still believe that. Something about the ocean, it puts things in perspective. She turned to face him, her expression unreadable. Then why didn't we? He hesitated, the answer lingering on the tip of his tongue. Life got in the way, he said finally. Work, the kids, the noise. Charlotte nodded, as if she had expected that answer. She let the curtain fall back into place and returned to her seat. Her wine glass was still half full, the deep red liquid reflecting her unease. "Do you ever wish we'd done things differently?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard met her eyes, the weight of the question settling over him. "All the time," he admitted. "But wishing doesn't change the past. It just makes you forget to live in the present." Her throat tightened at his honesty, and she looked down at her hands, twisting the gold band on her finger. "It feels like we've been holding our breath for years," she said. "Waiting for I don't even know what." He reached across the table, his fingers brushing hers once more. "Then maybe it's time we stopped waiting." The vulnerability in his eyes was disarming, and for a moment, Charlotte felt the wall she had so carefully built between them begin to crack. She hesitated, then let his hand close over hers, the familiar weight of his touch both comforting and terrifying. "What if we can't fix this?" she whispered. "Then at least we'll know we tried," Richard said, his voice steady. "But I think we can. I think we owe it to ourselves to try." The conviction in his words stirred something deep within her, a flicker of hope she had almost forgotten. She nodded slowly, her grip on his hand tightening. "Okay," she said softly. "Let's try." They sat like that for a long time, the silence between them no longer heavy, but full of possibility. Outside, the ocean continued its relentless rhythm, its waves whispering promises of renewal. The sound of waves crashing against the shore filled the room, a steady, rhythmic cadence that seemed to echo the unspoken words lingering between them. Richard leaned forward, his fingers tightening around Charlotte's hand. For the first time in years, he felt something stir, an ember of the connection they once shared, faint but persistent. Charlotte let her gaze drop to their joined hands, her breath hitching as she traced the familiar lines of his fingers. "I don't even know where to start," she said softly. Her voice carried a tremor, vulnerability slipping through the cracks in her composure. "We start here," Richard said, his tone firm yet gentle. "Right now. No past, no future. Just us." The simplicity of his words settled over her like a blanket, warming and grounding. She lifted her eyes to meet his, and for a moment, the years of distance, arguments, and unresolved hurt seemed to dissolve. What remained was raw, unfiltered truth. Two people who had lost their way but hadn't stopped searching. The room seemed smaller now, intimate in a way it hadn't been moments ago. The flickering candlelight painted shadows on the walls, wrapping them in an amber cocoon. Charlotte leaned back, pulling her hand away reluctantly as if to steady herself. Her lips parted, but the words didn't come easily. "I'm scared," she admitted finally. The confession hung in the air, fragile and exposed. Richard nodded, leaning back in his chair, though his eyes never left hers. "So am I. But I'm more scared of what happens if we don't try." The weight of his honesty hit her harder than she expected. She reached for her glass of wine, taking a slow sip to steady herself. The rich, earthy flavor filled her senses, grounding her in the moment. "What if we just don't know how anymore?" she asked, her voice quieter now. Richard's lips curved into a faint, bittersweet smile. "Then we learn. Together." The words were simple, but the conviction in his tone carried a strength that pulled at something deep inside her. She nodded, the faintest of smiles tugging at her lips. It wasn't much, but it was enough. "I don't know where this goes," she said, her voice firmer now. "But I want to try." Richard reached across the table once more, his hand closing gently over hers. That's all I needed to hear. For the first time in what felt like forever, Charlotte let herself breathe. The waves outside continued their endless rhythm, a reminder that even the strongest currents could find a way forward. And as they sat there, hands clasped and hearts open, they began to believe they could too. The waves outside the open window thundered against the rocky shore, the night air tinged with the salty tang of the sea. The room felt heavy with an unspoken tension, thick and all-encompassing. The antique table between them bore the weight of more than just the half-empty wine glasses. It was the invisible line of their shared history, laden with the baggage of years spent navigating both love and loss. Richard's fingers drummed against the edge of his glass, a nervous rhythm that betrayed the composure he tried to maintain. Across from him, Charlotte sat rigid, her slender fingers tracing the rim of her own glass, the gesture more for distraction than indulgence. The soft glow of the single candle on the table cast flickering shadows across her face, illuminating the fine lines around her eyes, lines Richard couldn't remember noticing before. "Charlotte," he began, his voice low and steady, though it threatened to crack under the weight of her name. I don't know how to fix this. I don't even know if we can. Her head tilted slightly, her gaze lifting to meet his. Her green eyes, once so vibrant and filled with fire, now seemed dulled by an exhaustion that went deeper than sleepless nights. She swallowed hard, her throat working against the lump that had been sitting there since the moment they sat down. I don't think it's about fixing anything, Richard, she said quietly. I think it's about whether we can live with what's broken. Her words hung in the air, a sharp contrast to the soothing backdrop of the waves. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table, as if bridging the gap between them could somehow close the emotional distance as well. And can we? He asked, his tone equal parts hopeful and desperate. The question wasn't just for her, it was for himself, for the universe, for anything that could provide clarity in a situation that felt anything but clear. Charlotte's lips parted, then closed again as though she wasn't sure of the answer herself. She broke eye contact, her gaze drifting to the window where the darkness outside felt safer than his searching eyes. I don't know, she admitted finally, her voice barely above a whisper. The silence that followed was deafening, the kind that felt alive, pressing against their chests and demanding acknowledgement. Richard reached for his glass, taking a long, slow sip as though the wine might fill the hollowness inside him. When he set the glass down, the soft clink seemed to echo louder than it should have. Do you remember, he said, his voice softer now, almost hesitant, when we used to sit on the porch and count the stars? How we'd try to name the constellations even though neither of us really knew them. Charlotte's lips twitched into the ghost of a smile. You always insisted that Orion's belt was in the wrong place, she murmured, a flicker of warmth coloring her tone. And I always told you you were wrong. And I always believed you, he said, leaning back in his chair. The edges of his mouth curved upward, but the sadness in his eyes remained. I believed you about a lot of things. Her smile faded, replaced by something far more complex. You shouldn't have had to, she said, her fingers tightening around her glass. You shouldn't have had to carry so much, Richard. I didn't mind carrying it, he replied quickly. I minded not knowing how to give you what you needed. Charlotte looked back at him then, truly looked at him, as though seeing the man before her for the first time in years. The vulnerability etched into his expression, the soft furrow of his brow, the way his shoulders hunched slightly, as though bracing for impact, struck something deep within her. You gave me more than I ever deserved, she said, her voice trembling with emotion she hadn't meant to reveal. But I didn't know how to take it. The raw honesty in her words made his chest tighten. He wanted to reach for her, to close the physical gap between them that felt so vast despite the mere feet separating them. But he stayed where he was, knowing instinctively that anything too sudden would shatter the fragile thread tethering them to this moment. I don't think it's about what we deserved, he said finally. I think it's about what we're willing to fight for now. Charlotte's eyes searched his face, her own emotions a maelstrom of doubt and longing. And what if we fight, and it still isn't enough? Then we'll know we tried, Richard replied simply. But I'd rather fail trying with you than succeed without you. The sincerity in his voice left her breathless, and she found herself gripping the edge of the table as though it might ground her. The weight of their shared history bore down on her like a tidal wave, every fight, every moment of laughter, every touch, every tear. The years had left their mark on both of them, but they hadn't erased the foundation they had built, however cracked it might now be. What if we don't even know how to begin? She asked, her voice trembling with the enormity of the question. We start small, Richard said, his tone steady but tender. One step at a time. One conversation at a time. She nodded slowly, her gaze dropping to her lap as her fingers twisted together. When she looked back up, her eyes glistened with unshed tears, but her expression held a glimmer of something else, hope perhaps. Okay, she said softly. One step at a time. The storm outside seemed to lessen, the waves receding into a gentler rhythm as if mirroring the tentative peace that had settled between them. Richard reached across the table, his hand hovering just above hers. After a moment's hesitation, she placed her hand in his, their fingers entwining with a familiarity that felt both foreign and comforting. As the candlelight flickered between them, casting shadows and light in equal measure, they sat in silence, letting the moment stretch and settle. For the first time in years, the silence didn't feel like an enemy. It felt like a beginning. The moonlight filtered through the sheer curtains, casting faint silvery patterns on the hardwood floor of their room. The air inside was thick with the remnants of their last conversation, the words hanging like ghosts between them. Richard sat on the edge of the bed, his hands clasped together, his gaze fixed on a point somewhere in the middle distance. His shoulders were slouched, the weight of the moment pressing heavily on his frame. Charlotte stood by the window, her silhouette outlined by the faint glow from the world outside. She was still, save for the subtle rise and fall of her chest as she breathed deeply, trying to steady herself. The room was silent except for the rhythmic ticking of the old clock on the nightstand, its sound a constant reminder of time slipping through their fingers. "You should sleep," she said softly, not turning to face him. "So should you," Richard replied, his voice equally quiet but tinged with exhaustion. She let out a breath that was almost a laugh, though there was no humor in it. "I don't know if I can." He looked at her then, his brow furrowing as he took in the tension in her posture, the way her fingers gripped the edge of the windowsill. "Charlotte," he began, his tone careful, as though afraid to push her further away. "You don't have to keep everything inside. You can talk to me." She shook her head, her gaze still focused outward, watching the faint movement of tree branches swaying in the breeze. "I wouldn't even know where to start," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Anywhere," he urged, leaning forward slightly. "Just anywhere." The vulnerability in his voice made her throat tighten, but she didn't turn around. She couldn't. Not yet. "I don't think it's as simple as that," she said after a long pause. "There are things I don't know how to say. Things I'm not sure you'd want to hear." Richard stood then, his movements slow and deliberate, as though giving her time to prepare for his approach. "Charlotte," he said again, stepping closer. "I want to hear it all. The good, the bad, whatever it is, I can handle it." She finally turned to face him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "And what if I can't?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What if saying it out loud makes it real in a way I'm not ready for?" He stopped a few feet away from her, not wanting to invade her space but needing her to know he was there. "It's already real," he said gently. "Not saying it doesn't change that." Her eyes searched his face, and for a moment she seemed to waver, caught between the fear of opening up and the need for release. "I feel like I've been running on empty for so long," she confessed, her words tumbling out in a rush. "Like I've been holding everything together with duct tape and sheer willpower, and now it's all starting to come apart." Richard's expression softened, and he took another step closer. "You don't have to hold it all together alone," he said. "You never did." She laughed softly, though it was more bitter than amused. "I thought I was protecting you. Protecting us. And instead you shut me out," he said, his tone gentle but firm. "Do you know how hard it is to watch someone you love carry so much alone and not know how to help?" Her tears spilled over then, and she looked away, wiping at her cheeks with the back of her hand. "I didn't mean to shut you out," she said, her voice breaking. "I just didn't know how to let you in." Richard closed the distance between them, reaching out to gently cup her face in his hands. The gesture was tender, deliberate, and it broke something inside her. "I'm here," he said softly, his thumbs brushing away her tears. "I've always been here." She closed her eyes, leaning into his touch as a sob escaped her. For a moment they stood like that, her hands clutching his wrists as though he were the only thing keeping her from falling apart completely. When she finally opened her eyes, there was something raw and unguarded in her gaze. "I don't know if I can fix this," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "You don't have to fix it alone," he replied. "We'll figure it out together." The sincerity in his voice was her undoing, and she nodded, a faint glimmer of hope flickering in the depths of her despair. "Okay," she whispered. Richard pulled her into his arms then, holding her tightly as the weight of their shared pain pressed down on them. But in that moment it felt lighter somehow, as though sharing it had made it bearable. The clock continued to tick softly in the background, but neither of them noticed. For the first time in a long time, the passage of time didn't feel like an enemy. It felt like a beginning. The room darkened as the last light of the day faded, leaving the muted glow of the lamp as their only illumination. Richard held Charlotte tightly, his chin resting on the top of her head. Her body trembled against his, not with the cold, but with the overwhelming release of everything she'd been holding inside. He didn't rush her, didn't speak, just let her be in the moment as her tears soaked into his shirt. "I don't know how to start," she whispered after a while, her voice muffled against his chest. "There's just so much." "Then start small," Richard said gently, pulling back just enough to look at her. "One thing at a time. We'll figure it out." She nodded, though her gaze stayed fixed on a point somewhere near his collarbone. "I feel like I've lost who I am," she began hesitantly. "Like somewhere along the way, I stopped being Charlotte and became this shadow of myself." Richard's brow furrowed. "When did you start feeling this way?" She hesitated, her hands still clutching his arms as if she needed the grounding. "I don't know." It's been years, maybe longer. It's not one thing, Richard. It's everything. The expectations, the routines, the compromises that turned into sacrifices I didn't even realize I was making until it was too late. He swallowed hard, guilt flickering in his eyes. I didn't see it. I should have seen it. It's not your fault, she said quickly, shaking her head. I didn't give you a chance to see it. I thought if I could just keep going, if I could just be strong enough, it would get better. But it didn't. It just got harder. Richard exhaled slowly, his hands sliding down her arms until he clasped her hands in his. Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you let me help you? Because I didn't want to be a burden, she admitted, her voice breaking again. You already had so much on your plate, and I didn't want to add to it. He shook his head, his grip tightening on her hands. You were never a burden, Charlotte. Never. I married you because I wanted to share everything with you, the good, the bad, all of it. But somewhere along the line, I think we both forgot that. She looked up at him, her eyes red-rimmed but earnest. Do you think we can find it again? What we had? Richard was silent for a long moment, his gaze searching hers. I think we can find something even better, he said finally. But it's going to take work, and it's going to take both of us being honest about what we need. Can we do that? Charlotte hesitated, but then she nodded, a glimmer of determination shining through her doubt. Yes, she said softly. I want to try. Good. Richard smiled faintly, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. Then let's start right now. He led her to the couch, and they sat together, their knees touching. For the first time in years they talked, not about logistics or responsibilities, but about their fears, their regrets, their hopes. The words came slowly at first, halting and unsure, but as the night wore on, the floodgates opened. They spoke of things they had kept buried for too long, and with each revelation, the invisible wall between them crumbled a little more. At some point, the rain started. It pattered softly against the windows, a gentle backdrop to their conversation. They didn't notice the time slipping away until the first faint light of dawn began to creep into the room. Charlotte was curled against Richard's side, her head resting on his shoulder, their hands intertwined. We have a long way to go, she said quietly, her voice heavy with exhaustion but laced with a faint hope. We do, Richard agreed, pressing a kiss to her temple. But we're not going to walk it alone. For the first time in what felt like forever, the tension in the room eased. The dawn brought with it the promise of a new beginning, fragile but full of possibility. They weren't fixed and they weren't whole, but they were together. And for now, that was enough. The morning light spilled through the curtains, painting the room in soft gold. Charlotte stirred against Richard's shoulder, her breathing slow and steady. He hadn't moved for hours, unwilling to disrupt the fragile peace they had found. His arm had gone numb, but he welcomed the discomfort, a small price for the closeness they'd reclaimed. As her eyes fluttered open, she blinked against the light and looked up at him, disoriented at first. Then her expression softened. You didn't sleep? I didn't want to, he replied with a faint smile. Not when we were finally. Here. Charlotte sat up, brushing her hair out of her face. Here feels strange. Like I've been running for so long, I forgot what it felt like to stop. Maybe it's time we stopped running, Richard said, his tone gentle but firm. From everything. From ourselves. Her gaze dropped to her hands, her fingers absently twisting the wedding band she still wore. What if I don't know how? Then we learn together, he said, taking her hands in his. One step at a time. The words lingered between them, as heavy as they were hopeful. For years, their lives had been a blur of obligations, unspoken resentments, and moments lost in the chaos of simply trying to survive. But now, with the weight of silence finally lifted, they saw each other in a new light, raw, imperfect, but deeply human. Charlotte sighed, leaning back against the couch. Where do we even start? Breakfast, Richard suggested, his lips quirking into a smile. The laugh that escaped her was small but genuine, and it warmed him to his core. Breakfast, she echoed, nodding. They moved to the kitchen together, navigating the space with the ease of years spent sharing it. The fridge held little more than leftovers and condiments, and Richard made a mental note to go shopping later. He pulled out eggs and bread, while Charlotte found a frying pan and the toaster. It felt almost absurd, the mundanity of the task after the emotional storm of the night before, but it was grounding. As they cooked, the silence between them was different, companionable, no longer weighed down by unspoken truths. Charlotte cracked an egg into the pan and watched it sizzle, the sound filling the small kitchen. "You always liked your eggs sunny side up," she said, her voice carrying a faint note of nostalgia. "And you always burned the toast," Richard replied, earning a playful glare. "I call it artisanal," she shot back, though the corners of her mouth lifted in a reluctant smile. By the time they sat down to eat, the tension that had hung over them for months seemed to have eased, if only slightly. They ate slowly, savoring the simplicity of the meal and the shared quiet. "Richard," Charlotte said suddenly, setting her fork down. "I think I need to talk to someone. A therapist." He looked at her, surprised but not unkindly. "What brought that on?" "I've been carrying so much," she admitted, her hands curling into loose fists on the table. "And last night made me realize I've been drowning in it. I don't want to keep dragging you down with me." "You're not dragging me down," he said firmly, reaching across the table to take her hand. "But if talking to someone can help you, I'm all for it. I'll even come with you if you want." Charlotte's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "Thank you." They finished their meal, and as Richard cleared the plates, he felt a flicker of hope he hadn't dared to entertain in a long time. They were far from fixed, and the road ahead would be rocky, but they had taken a step forward. And that, he thought, was something. The day passed quietly. Richard busied himself with yard work while Charlotte spent hours on the phone, making appointments and catching up with friends she hadn't spoken to in years. It was a start, a small re-entry into the world she'd withdrawn from. In the evening, they found themselves on the back porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The sky was a riot of colors, burnt orange, deep violet, and the faintest hint of gold. Richard handed Charlotte a glass of wine, and they sat in companionable silence, listening to the cicadas hum in the distance. "You know," Charlotte said, swirling the wine in her glass, "it feels strange to hope again. Like I'm scared to let myself believe things can get better." "Hope's scary," Richard agreed. "But it's worth it." She looked at him, her gaze steady. "Do you think we can really do this? Put everything back together?" "I don't think we can put it back the way it was," he admitted. "But maybe we can build something new. Something better." Charlotte leaned her head against his shoulder, her breath warm against his neck. "I want that," she said softly. "I really do." As the stars began to pepper the darkening sky, Richard wrapped an arm around her and pulled her close. They didn't need to say anything more. The night stretched before them, quiet and full of possibility, and for the first time in a long while, they felt like they could face it together. The following days fell into a rhythm that felt foreign but welcome, like discovering an old song they'd once loved but forgotten. Charlotte threw herself into her therapy sessions, emerging from each with a mix of exhaustion and cautious clarity. Richard, meanwhile, focused on the practicalities, house repairs, errands, and cooking meals they could share without the strain of words. One evening, as the rain returned, drumming softly against the windows, Richard found Charlotte in the study. She was sitting in the worn leather armchair that had been his father's, a book open in her lap, but her gaze distant. "Hey," he said softly, not wanting to startle her. She looked up, her expression shifting from surprise to a tentative smile. "Hey." He stepped into the room, the warmth of the fire she'd lit wrapping around him like a second skin. "Mind if I join you?" "Of course not." She gestured to the couch opposite her. For a while, they sat in silence, the only sound the crackling fire and the occasional rustle of pages as Charlotte idly flipped through her book. Richard studied her in the flickering light, noticing how the lines around her eyes seemed softer, her shoulders less tense. "How was your session today?" he asked, breaking the quiet. Charlotte hesitated, then closed the book and set it aside. "It was intense. Good, but intense. Do you want to talk about it?" She met his gaze, searching his face for something. "It feels strange, you know? Unpacking everything. Admitting how much I've been carrying. How much I've been avoiding." Richard nodded, leaning forward. "It's not easy. But you're doing it, and that's incredible." Her lips curved into a small, almost shy smile. "I don't know about incredible. Necessary, maybe." "Sometimes necessary is the bravest thing," he said, his voice steady. The firelight danced across her face as she considered his words. "Thank you," she said finally, "for not giving up on me. On us." Richard felt something tighten in his chest, a mix of relief, gratitude, and the faintest flicker of hope. "I told you, Charlotte. We're in this together." They talked late into the night, their conversation meandering from light-hearted memories of their early years together to the heavier topics they'd avoided for so long. For the first time in what felt like forever, the barriers between them seemed to dissolve, leaving only the raw, unvarnished truth. The days continued to pass, each one a small step forward. They started spending more time together, rediscovering the things they used to enjoy: long walks, cooking experiments, and quiet evenings on the porch. The cracks in their relationship hadn't disappeared, but they no longer felt insurmountable. One Saturday, as they worked side by side in the garden, Charlotte paused, wiping her forehead with the back of her hand. "I was thinking," she began, glancing at Richard. "Maybe we should take a trip." Richard looked up from the tomato plants he was tending. "A trip? Yeah, just us. Somewhere quiet, away from everything. A reset." He straightened, brushing dirt from his hands. "Where were you thinking?" Charlotte shrugged, a hopeful glint in her eyes. "The coast, maybe? Somewhere with a view of the ocean. We could rent a little cottage, take some time to just be." Richard felt a smile tug at his lips. "I like the sound of that." The trip came together quickly. A small seaside town a few hours' drive away, known for its rocky shores and quaint charm. When they arrived, the salty air and rhythmic crash of waves immediately began to work their magic. The cottage they'd rented was cozy, with a stone fireplace and a view of the water from nearly every window. For the first time in years, they felt like they could breathe. They spent their days exploring the town, wandering along the beach, and cooking simple meals in the cottage's tiny kitchen. The evenings were reserved for the porch, where they sat wrapped in blankets, watching the sun dip below the horizon. One night, as they stood on the beach under a canopy of stars, Charlotte slipped her hand into Richard's. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what?" he asked, his thumb brushing against her knuckles. "For this. For not giving up. For being here." Richard turned to her, the moonlight catching the faint sheen of tears in her eyes. "I told you, Charlotte. Wherever you are, that's where I'll be." She leaned into him, her head resting against his shoulder as the waves lapped at their feet. In that moment, with the ocean stretching endlessly before them and the stars shining brightly above, they felt something they hadn't in a long time: peace. Their return home after the trip felt different. The house, once filled with tension and silence, now carried an air of tentative hope. The walls seemed less oppressive, the rooms brighter, as if the echoes of their rekindled connection had begun to soften its edges. Charlotte and Richard continued their efforts to rebuild not just their relationship, but their individual selves. Therapy became a cornerstone for both of them. Charlotte's sessions unearthed layers of grief and insecurity that she had buried for years. Richard began attending his own, confronting the unspoken burdens he had carried as a husband and father. On evenings when they weren't wrapped in the routine of household chores, they found themselves gravitating toward each other. The study became a shared refuge, its walls bearing witness to their late-night conversations and moments of quiet reflection. Books, once a symbol of solitude, became bridges they crossed together. One particularly cold evening, Charlotte was curled up on the couch, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. Richard entered, carrying a blanket which he draped over her shoulders before sitting down beside her. The fire crackled between them, its warmth mirrored in their exchange of glances. "Do you ever think about what comes next?" she asked suddenly, her voice soft. Richard tilted his head, studying her face. "What do you mean?" "Us," she replied, her gaze dropping to the steam curling from her mug. "What does our future look like? I feel like we've been so focused on the now, on repairing what's broken, that I haven't thought about where we're going." He leaned back, the leather of the couch creaking under his weight. "I think about it all the time," he admitted. "And honestly, I don't have a clear picture. But I know I want you in it, whatever it looks like." Her lips curved into a small, tentative smile. "That's a good start." They sat in silence for a moment, the firelight playing across their faces. Then Richard spoke again, his tone lighter. "Do you remember the plans we used to make? Traveling the world, building that dream cabin in the woods. Raising a herd of goats," Charlotte added with a chuckle. "Hey, that was your idea," Richard countered, grinning. "I was more about the vineyard." "Oh, right. Because you were going to become a world-class winemaker," she teased. He shrugged, his smile widening. Still could happen. The laughter that followed felt like a balm, a reminder of the ease they'd once shared and were slowly rediscovering. In the weeks that followed, their connection deepened. It wasn't always smooth, there were arguments and moments of doubt, but they faced them head-on, refusing to let old patterns resurface. They began to redefine their partnership, not as a return to what they had been, but as a step towards something new. One Saturday afternoon, they decided to tackle the attic, a space that had long been ignored and was filled with relics of their past. Dust motes danced in the sunlight streaming through the small window as they opened boxes and unearthed forgotten treasures. Charlotte pulled out a photo album, its cover worn and corners frayed. She sat cross-legged on the floor, flipping through the pages. "Look at this," she said, holding up a picture of the two of them from their honeymoon. They were young, sunburned, and laughing, caught mid-movement as they danced on a beach. Richard knelt beside her, peering at the photo. "God, we were so carefree back then. We didn't have a clue what we were doing," she said, her voice tinged with fondness. "Still don't," he quipped, earning a playful swat on the arm. As they continued sorting, they came across old letters, keepsakes from their children's early years, and items that brought both laughter and tears. The process was cathartic, each item a reminder of where they had been and how far they had come. Later that evening, as they sat on the couch with glasses of wine, Charlotte reached for Richard's hand. "Today reminded me why I fell in love with you," she said, her voice steady but soft. Richard's fingers tightened around hers. "And today reminded me that falling in love isn't a one-time thing. I think I'm falling in love with you all over again." Her smile was luminous, and for the first time in a long while it reached her eyes. "Me too." The journey ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, they both felt ready to face it together. They had weathered the storm, and though the road was still winding, they knew they were walking it side by side. As winter gave way to spring, the rhythm of their lives found a balance they hadn't experienced in years. The seasons mirrored their progress, each day bringing small but significant changes. The house, once a silent testament to what was lost, now felt alive again with shared laughter, conversation, and plans for the future. Charlotte found herself drawn back to her painting, something she hadn't done since their children were small. One afternoon, she set up her easel in the sunroom. Brushes in hand, she allowed the colors to flow freely, her emotions guiding every stroke. Richard, passing through with his morning coffee, paused to watch. "You've still got it," he said, his tone warm but playful. She glanced over her shoulder, a smile tugging at her lips. "Flattery won't get you out of doing the dishes tonight." He laughed, but the sincerity in his gaze lingered. "I mean it, Charlotte. It's good to see you doing this again." Their moments together became less about filling silence and more about creating something meaningful. Weekend hikes in the nearby forest, dinners where they cooked side by side, even the occasional spontaneous dance in the kitchen, all served as reminders of the life they were rebuilding. One evening, they invited their children over for dinner. The family gathered around the table, the familiar cacophony of voices and clinking silverware filling the air. Their son, Ben, raised an eyebrow as he watched his parents exchange a quiet smile over the table. "You two seem different," he said, his tone curious. Charlotte and Richard exchanged a glance, their hands brushing briefly as they reached for the same dish. "We're working on things," Richard said simply. "Good," Ben replied, nodding. "You deserve to be happy. Both of you." Their daughter, Lily, chimed in, teasing her brother about his knack for stating the obvious. The room erupted into laughter, and for a moment, everything felt perfect. Later that night, as they cleaned up together, Richard turned to Charlotte. "Did you notice? They weren't walking on eggshells around us this time." Charlotte nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude. "They feel it too, that we're trying." As summer approached, they decided to take a trip, just the two of them. A cabin by the lake, far from the distractions of everyday life, seemed the perfect escape. The drive was filled with easy conversation and comfortable silence, the scenery shifting from urban chaos to serene countryside. The cabin was small but cozy, nestled among tall pines with a view of the water that seemed to stretch endlessly. On their first evening, they sat on the porch, the sun dipping below the horizon in a blaze of orange and pink. "This feels right," Charlotte murmured, leaning against Richard's shoulder. He wrapped an arm around her, pulling her closer. "It does." The days that followed were filled with simple pleasures, canoeing across the lake, reading by the fire, and sharing quiet meals under the stars. Each moment felt like a step further away from the pain of the past and closer to the promise of a new beginning. One night, as the fire crackled in the hearth, Richard pulled out a small, wrapped box. "I've been meaning to give you this," he said, his voice hesitant. Charlotte took the box, her brow furrowing as she carefully unwrapped it. Inside was a necklace, a simple silver chain with a small, intricately designed pendant. "It's beautiful," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "What's the occasion?" "No occasion," he replied. "I just wanted you to have something. Something that reminds you of us. Of how far we've come." She blinked back tears, fastening the necklace around her neck. "Thank you, Richard. For everything." They sat in silence for a long while, the warmth of the fire matching the quiet glow of their connection. In that moment, they weren't the people they had been, nor the people they had tried to become. They were simply Charlotte and Richard, flawed, healing, and deeply in love. The journey wasn't over, but for the first time, they felt like they were exactly where they were meant to be. The following morning, sunlight spilled into the cabin, casting golden streaks across the wooden floorboards. The lake outside shimmered under the soft embrace of dawn, a quiet promise of another peaceful day. Charlotte stirred first, her body relaxed in a way she hadn't felt in years. She turned to find Richard still asleep, his face softened by the glow of morning light. For a moment, she let herself simply watch him, her heart swelling with a quiet gratitude that felt like a revelation. By the time Richard awoke, Charlotte was outside, her bare feet brushing against the dew-laden grass as she stood near the edge of the lake. She had brought her sketchbook, the pages already alive with delicate lines capturing the reflection of trees on the water. Richard stepped onto the porch, coffee in hand, the sight of her sparking something warm and unspoken within him. "Morning," he called softly, his voice still laced with sleep. Charlotte turned, her lips curving into a smile that felt entirely natural. "Morning. Coffee smells amazing." He joined her by the lake, offering her the mug. "I figured you could use some inspiration." She took it gratefully, their fingers brushing briefly in a way that sent a ripple through her. "This place inspires me enough," she said, gesturing to the serene landscape. "But thank you." The day unfolded in easy rhythm. They explored the woods surrounding the cabin, their laughter mingling with the sound of rustling leaves. At one point, Richard reached for her hand to steady her as they crossed a small stream. She held on longer than necessary, the gesture speaking volumes neither of them felt the need to put into words. By the time they returned to the cabin, the sky had shifted to a deep amber, the promise of dusk on the horizon. They prepared dinner together, moving around the small kitchen in a quiet dance that spoke of their growing ease with one another. Charlotte caught herself smiling as Richard hummed an old tune, his hands deftly chopping vegetables with the confidence of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" she teased, leaning against the counter. "Survival skills," he replied with a grin. "You don't survive college on takeout alone." Charlotte laughed, the sound filling the space between them. It felt good, easy, unforced. She couldn't remember the last time something as simple as a shared meal had brought her so much joy. After dinner, they retreated to the porch with glasses of wine, the night air cool but inviting. Fireflies danced in the darkness, their glow punctuating the symphony of crickets and rustling leaves. Richard leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the stars above. "Do you ever think about the future?" he asked suddenly, his voice low. Charlotte turned to him, her expression softening. "All the time. But for the first time in years, it doesn't scare me." He looked at her then, his eyes searching hers for a long moment. "Neither does it for me," he admitted. "And I think it's because of you." The weight of his words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Charlotte reached out, her hand finding his. Their fingers intertwined, and for a moment they simply sat there, letting the night wrap around them like a blanket. "I don't know what's ahead," she said softly, "but I know I want us to face it together." Richard smiled, his grip on her hand tightening slightly. "Me too." They stayed on the porch until the wine was gone, and the chill of the night drove them inside. As they prepared for bed, the easy rhythm between them remained, unspoken but deeply felt. Charlotte lay awake for a while after the lights were turned off, listening to Richard's steady breathing beside her. She reached out, her fingers brushing his arm lightly. "Thank you," she whispered, not sure if he was awake to hear it. "For what?" he murmured, his voice thick with sleep. "For not giving up," she said simply. He turned toward her, his hand finding hers in the dark. "Never," he said, his voice steady. "Not on us." The next morning they packed up the cabin, neither of them eager to leave, but both carrying the quiet hope of what lay ahead. As they drove back toward the life they were building, Charlotte glanced over at Richard, her heart full in a way it hadn't been in years. For the first time in a long time, the road ahead felt open, inviting, and entirely theirs to travel together. The days that followed felt like walking on a knife's edge, the weight of unspoken truths pressing down on every interaction. The quiet tension between James and Nora simmered beneath the surface, and though their routines resumed, they carried an undercurrent of fragility. Every shared glance, every accidental touch, seemed heavier with meaning. One evening, as twilight painted the sky in shades of violet and gold, James found Nora standing in their garden. The cool air was thick with the scent of lavender, and the soft buzz of crickets filled the silence. She held a glass of wine in her hand, her fingers wrapped tightly around the stem as though it were the only thing anchoring her. He approached cautiously, his footsteps crunching against the gravel. "Beautiful night," he offered, his voice quiet. She nodded without turning. "It is. Peaceful." James hesitated, unsure if he should press forward. But the weight of everything left unsaid was suffocating, and he couldn't hold it in any longer. "Nora," he began, his voice trembling slightly. I think we need to talk." She exhaled sharply, her shoulders rising and falling with the motion. "Do we? Or are you going to tell me something I already know?" Her words hit him like a punch to the gut, but he pressed on. "I don't want to lose what we have. I don't want to lose you." Nora turned then, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "What we have, James, isn't what it used to be. And maybe that's the problem. We're trying to hold on to something that's already gone." His heart clenched, but he took a step closer. "That doesn't mean we can't find something new. Build something better." She looked at him for a long moment, searching his face as though trying to find the man she had once fallen in love with. "I don't know if I can trust you again," she said finally, her voice breaking. "Not in the same way." "I know," he said softly. "And I don't expect it to happen overnight. But I'm willing to try if you are." Nora's grip on the wineglass loosened slightly, and for the first time in what felt like weeks, her shoulders relaxed. "It can't just be words, James. I need to see actions. I need to see that you mean it." "I do," he promised, his voice steady with conviction. "I know I haven't shown it before, but I will now. I'll do whatever it takes." They stood in silence for a while, the cool night air wrapping around them like a fragile truce. Nora took a sip of her wine, her gaze drifting to the horizon where the first stars were beginning to appear. "One step at a time," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. James nodded, relief washing over him like a tide. One step at a time. And as they stood there, side by side, the world around them quiet and still, it felt like the first step toward something new, a tentative, fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, they could rebuild. The days turned into weeks, and true to his word, James committed himself to rebuilding what had been lost. It wasn't just grand gestures, though he made those too, but the small, consistent actions that began to stitch their fractured relationship together. He was present in a way he hadn't been for years, engaging in the mundane details of their shared life with genuine interest. He began cooking dinners again, a habit he'd abandoned years ago when work became all-consuming. He surprised Nora with her favorite dishes, even managing to replicate her mother's rosemary chicken recipe. At first, she was hesitant to accept these gestures, but gradually, the walls between them began to lower. One rainy Saturday, James found Nora curled up on the couch, a book in her lap, though she wasn't reading. Her gaze was distant, fixed on the steady rhythm of rain sliding down the window. "Mind some company?" he asked, holding 2 mugs of steaming tea. She looked at him, surprised before nodding. "Sure." He handed her a mug and sat beside her, leaving enough space to respect her boundaries, but close enough to feel the warmth of her presence. They sat in silence for a while, the rain providing a gentle soundtrack. "Do you remember that trip to Paris?" he asked suddenly, breaking the quiet. She turned to him, her brow furrowing. "Which one?" "The one where we got lost in Montmartre. You insisted we find that little cafe you'd read about, and we ended up walking in circles for hours." A small smile tugged at her lips. "And when we finally found it, they were closed for renovations." James chuckled. "But we stumbled upon that tiny bookstore instead. You found that signed copy of Hemingway, and I couldn't drag you out of there for another hour." Her smile grew, and for a moment the tension eased. "That was a good trip." "It was." He hesitated before adding, "I want us to have more of those." The weight of his words lingered between them, and she looked away, her fingers tracing the rim of her mug. "It's not just about trips or memories, James. It's about everything in between. The day-to-day. That's where it fell apart." "I know," he admitted, his voice quiet. "And I can't change the past. But I can show you that I've learned, that I'm willing to put in the work." She studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she set her mug down and stood, walking to the window. The rain blurred the world outside, turning the garden into a watercolor painting. "I need time," she said, her voice barely audible over the rain, "to see if this is real, to see if I can let myself believe it again." James stood as well, maintaining a careful distance. "Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere." The weeks continued, marked by tentative progress and moments of vulnerability. They began having honest conversations about their past, conversations that were painful but necessary. Nora admitted the ways she had felt neglected and unseen, and James owned his mistakes without deflecting or justifying them. One evening, they found themselves sorting through old photo albums, something they hadn't done in years. They laughed over the ridiculous outfits they'd worn in the 90s, reminisced about vacations, and marveled at how young they looked when they first started dating. "You had so much hair back then," Nora teased, running her fingers over a photo of him with wild curls. "And you never had a single gray," he shot back, earning a playful swat on the arm. The laughter felt natural, unforced, and for the first time in what felt like forever, they both let their guard down. Months later, James surprised Nora with a weekend getaway to a small coastal town they'd visited early in their marriage. It wasn't Paris or Montmartre, but it held its own quiet charm. They walked along the beach, the salt air tangling in Nora's hair as she let the waves lap at her feet. One evening, as they sat on the balcony of their rented cottage, watching the sun dip below the horizon, James reached for her hand. She didn't pull away. "I know it's been a long road," he said, his voice steady, "but I hope you know how grateful I am that you've stayed." Nora looked at him, her eyes soft. "It hasn't been easy, but I can see you're trying, and that means more than you know." They sat in silence, the sound of the waves filling the spaces between their words. For the first time in years, the quiet felt comforting rather than heavy. As the stars began to scatter across the sky, James leaned closer. "Here's to new beginnings." Nora raised her glass in response, a small but genuine smile gracing her lips. To new beginnings. And as the night enveloped them, it felt as though they had turned a corner, not back to what they had been, but towards something new, something stronger. Together.